I'm Ant Gould, Director of Faculties at the Chartered Insurance Institute, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Caroline Wayman, Chief Ombudsman and Chief Executive of the Ombudsman Service. Welcome, Caroline.
Thank you.
The CII recently asked members, through the faculty boards and via social media, what they would like to ask the Ombudsman, and we were inundated with questions. They fell mainly into three categories, which I'll be touching on today. They are: what does fair and reasonable mean? Compensating people for non-financial loss, and the Ombudsman's approach to non-disclosure. So Caroline, let's start with our first set of questions around the issue of fair and reasonable. Insurers often feel that fair and reasonable is not very well defined. If the Ombudsman regularly departs from previous discussions or guidance, how can firms really be confident in what fair and reasonable means?
Well, I think the really important thing to emphasise about the fair and reasonable thing is that it is about fair and reasonable in all the circumstances of the individual case. So what the Ombudsman will do is look at the individual circumstances, but then think about what's fair and reasonable, taking into account a range of factors, including the law, regulatory guidance, and importantly, what's good industry practice. So it isn't just that the Ombudsman just thinks what's fair in isolation. It's very much doing so taking into account all of those relevant factors.
In final decisions, Ombudsmen refer to established views about different topics. Could these views be easily available on your website or perhaps published to help firms decide what is fair and reasonable for consumers?
So there's really a lot of information on our website. So there's a lot of information in the technical advice part of our website. All of our decisions, of course, are now published, so that's all there for everybody to see. But Ombudsman News we publish very regularly, and that provides case studies for people to go and have a look and see what's happening. So there really is a lot of information there, and I really would encourage insurers that if they want to know our approach about a particular issue, then go to that online technical resource part of our website, and it may very well be that there'll be a note about our usual approach to those things, and do look at the website as well, because that can the website in terms of the published decisions, because that can really help just to see it in practice. But actually for our general approach, it's usually better to look at things like Ombudsman News and the online technical resource to get a view about our usual approach in those sorts of circumstances.
Okay, I just want to ask you one more question on that. In terms of whether you monitor the consistency of the decisions that are coming through from the various ombudsmen, are you in a situation where you can highlight perhaps where this decision and this decision may appear to be different, but try and make it clear, especially to insurers or brokers, why they're different, and so it's not a single theme going through?
So I always encourage people, when they think that they're worried about our consistency, to give us examples. So if an insurer has got sort of two decisions from two different ombudsmen, or even the same ombudsman, that they think aren't consistent with one another, then actually draw those to our attention, and we can have a look. And very often when we do, actually what we conclude is that it is the individual facts that we're able to say, well, what distinguished that one from that one was this particular fact and circumstance, and that's why actually the outcome was different. So where people do have concerns, I really would encourage them to bring those to our attention, and we can have a look and see if we can help make people understand and the reasons why they were different.
Does the Ombudsman feel that there has been an increase in unfair terms and conditions in insurance contracts?
I think it's a really interesting question about whether there's been any increase. I mean, I think it's not something that I would say I've particularly noticed or that my colleagues have particularly highlighted. It's not something either that we particularly track in terms of, registering or counting the number of terms that we think look unfair. I guess the thing I would say though is that what we do see is at times insurers wanting to make changes to the contract and to the policy based perhaps on particular individual cases or claims that they've had, and I guess I would just urge a bit of caution in moving to change things just on the basis of one case, because insurance contracts, I think I would say, have got quite complicated, and some more than others, and that can create difficulties, I think, for consumers to be able to understand what they're getting.
Okay, just slightly pick up on that one a bit. So if an insurer sort of overreacts perhaps to a single decision, and then a similar case along those lines come up straight afterwards, will you take that into consideration?
I'm not sure which bit you mean to take into consideration. I mean, I think I mean, obviously our job is always an individual one. So, I mean, the starting point would be to look at the policy and see what the terms and conditions say. And if it's an exclusion that the insurer's relying on, we would look at that to see whether or not the exclusion applied. And obviously if they've made a change to try and catch that claim, then the wording would have changed. But I just think that, you know, as I said, insurers perhaps need to at times just think about whether it is individual. And I know that insurers think long and hard about how to construct the contracts, but recognising that sometimes our decisions really are that unusual fact or circumstance, and they don't necessarily mean that there's a whole category of claims that need to be worried about, I think is something I would just advise.
Now I'd like to move on to a section looking at non-financial loss. So to start with the first question, the Ombudsman recently changed its online guidance about compensation for non-financial loss, and in particular the recommended bands for different levels of redress. Now, as I understand it, the lowest bands used to go up to 300 and it's now up to 500. As this is quite broad, would you, the Ombudsman, consider giving more specific examples of suitable redress? For example, what would merit £100, £200 or £400?
So we've tried to provide a few examples already on the website. So again, encourage people to go to the website and have a look. And as I've been saying, obviously our decisions are published as well, so that can give some further help and steer. I have to say, I'm a bit cautious about the idea of trying to give very specific, this sort of circumstance equals this amount, because the really important thing when trying to assess what's an appropriate amount is about thinking about the impact on the individual. So I think it can be a mistake to try and categorise sorts of distress and say that's worth this much and that's worth that, because you know, the impact on an individual can vary enormously. So to use an example, I mean, sending a letter to the wrong address, to your old address, let's say, could be something that has very minimal impact on an individual consumer and which, you know, may or may not even merit an award of compensation. But if that letter was sent to accidentally to your former spouse, perhaps where there'd been domestic violence issues, and that by doing so that revealed where you were now living, well, that's a very different ballgame, and I think we'd all recognise that. So it's very much about thinking about the impact for the individual as opposed to thinking about trying to have categories. I'd also really encourage insurers to think about how to look at it in the round, and so not to sort of tot up sorts of issues that occurred and say, so therefore it's worth X or Y, but to look at the overall circumstances and say, well, so overall, how much impact has that had on the individual, and therefore what sort of award should be made. And I think the final thing I would say is that it is an area where, of course, there is a subjective judgment to be made, and the important thing I think is really to be getting in the right ballpark and to be getting, you know, if it's a meaningful issue where you really need to recognise that, then it's much more likely that a consumer will accept that if you try and think about those individual issues and try and match your award to that. As opposed to thinking that it's an absolute science. There's a bit of art here as well as science, I think, but really think about the individual consumer is the main message.
Thank you. Our next question sounds quite specific, but I think there's some broad themes here. It's in a situation where a consumer has suffered loss of use of a vehicle, should insurers make a separate payment for non-financial loss, or is it included in the £10 per day figure?
Well, the £10 a day figure is really to just compensate the individual for being without the car. So that's to think about things like transport costs and getting around without the car. So really it's a very sort of individual, fact-specific thing. So you need to just think about whether for that individual it's had any particular impact sort of over and above that which you might normally expect. And if it has, then yes, we would think about an award. So I think insurers just need to have a look at what's actually happened, the particular individual facts and circumstances, and think about whether or not there should be any further award as well as the £10 a day.
Would it be fair to say that the Ombudsman no longer makes any award under £100?
No, so there's certainly no new rule that we won't make awards under £100. I mean, for some circumstances, actually, a bunch of flowers might be the right answer, or just an apology, and you know, a real apology as opposed to a "I'm sorry if you felt that way" sort of apology, which in my experience doesn't usually go down all that well. So by no means a rule that that awards have to be over £100. But again, it's very much about looking at the individual facts, circumstances, and how it's impacted that individual, and therefore whether an award should be made that's greater than that.
Okay, thank you. Our next session is about non-disclosure, and this is a topic that came up a lot of times. So I'll bring down to 3 questions that sum those up. So we'll start with the first one. How does the Ombudsman decide whether someone has failed to disclose important information deliberately? After all, it's easy to say that you forgot something in order to present your case in the best possible light.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing we do is look at the question and how clear the question is, and that's a really important starting point. And then we look at the evidence about what the consumer actually said. So how did they respond to it? And, so we'll look at whatever is available from the point that the question was asked. So whether that's a form, whether it's an online form, perhaps sometimes a telephone conversation where we can get the call recording. And then we'll perhaps look at the further evidence that's available, including talking to the consumer and saying, tell us about it, tell us why you didn't disclose this, so we can try and understand a bit further. And if it's something that happened very recently and the question's very clear, then we're very unlikely to think that that's something the consumer shouldn't have put forward. But if the question's not all that clear and actually it's quite a while ago, and then again that would go to the other end, that you might think, well, I can understand why they didn't. But that's what you're basically doing, is weighing up sort of the plausibility of what they say now. And by no means is it the fact that just because you say, oh no, I didn't realise, is that going to be a get out of jail free card?
Okay, the next question is very similar but slightly different nuance really. This comes from a number of insurers. It says at inception, insurers ask consumers if they've suffered any household incidents, claims or losses, whether insured or not. However, they've been hesitant to avoid policies when they find out at claim stage that the consumer did have uninsured or unpaid losses. Would you say they're being too cautious?
I mean, I think again, you need to look at the question. Was it clear? Are you sure that a consumer would have understood that they needed to disclose the things that you were looking for? And I think uninsured losses is a phrase that insurers understand very well and what they mean by that. I guess I would question whether consumers would always understand what that meant. And so I think you have to look at that. So what was asked and how did they respond, and then weigh that up and decide whether or not you think it was reasonable that they didn't provide that information. And obviously, again, back to the less you think the question was clear, then obviously the less likely you are to think that you should be voiding the policy on that basis.
Okay, obviously it's still a bit of a grey area and always will be, I imagine. Last question on this is about, does the seriousness of the misrepresentation actually determine what remedies the insurer can use?
Yes, so this is something that's now embodied in the law, but something that's been the Ombudsman's practice for some time. So, in looking at any sort of, so the first thing is actually to look at whether there's been a misrepresentation. So that's sort of point number one. So again, look at what the question asked and then look at what the consumer said, and was that a misrepresentation? Did they fail to disclose something, is often the thing that you're thinking about. And then if they did, you need to think about actually kind of why and sort of what was their thinking in that. So there are different categories. So if you think that was reckless and that they've done that intentionally, then the full range of remedies are available. If you think it was careless, then actually it's a bit more nuanced, and you've got a bit more proportionate remedies that are available. But if you think it was innocent and they didn't realise that they were supposed to disclose it, then actually there won't really be remedies in terms of wanting to avoid the policy in those sorts of circumstances. But that's an area where we do put out quite a lot of information, and again I'd urge people to go to our website and have a look, and if they're not sure, chat it through with our technical advice desk. It can really help just weigh up those individual facts.
We've covered the main areas that came up in the questions, but I'd like to sort of pick in a few other questions that sort of stood out from the crowd. So first of all, the Ombudsman still seems to communicate a lot by post, which is both costly and time-consuming for everyone involved. What's holding you back from using electronic communication more?
Oh, we're certainly moving to a lot more electronic communication. It's something we're very keen to do, and actually in our own case handling operation we've moved across from big plastic bags with lots of paper in them to e-files. So that's something we've put in the last year actually. So it's something we're definitely doing more and more of, and keen to try and make sure that customers and businesses can access us in a range of different ways, and a lot of people do want to interact online, and so that's obviously something we want to do more of. But we also recognise that some people actually still want to send letters, and actually some people turn up at our offices with a bag full of paper and they want to talk about it. So I think, you know, as a service like ours is available for everybody. It's available to any consumer that wants to bring a complaint to us. So we need to be able to respond to that in whatever channel people need.
Okay, so there's never going to be a cut-off because, as you say, it's down to the individual consumer. Next one is, given the sustained period of low interest rates, and I expect even in a year's time from now we might still be in this situation, are there any plans to revise the 8% currently awarded on top of some types of redress?
Well, we keep these things under review regularly. I mean, that's the sort of standard rate that we tend to use where it's a situation where it's sort of compensating you for being out of the money. And, you know, that's something that reflects the award that the courts often make in similar circumstances. But I think it's important to say that these are always individual assessments. And so, I mean, it does depend on what sort of case it is. So, you know, in some of our casework, actually, the losses for the individual would be greater than 8% because perhaps they were borrowing money. And so that would be the appropriate rate at which to compensate people. But in other circumstances, it might be different. It might be less than that. But the typical rate is still 8% for being out of the money, but we keep that under regular review.
In the past, the Ombudsman has dismissed or rejected complaints about commercial pricing decisions, for example, about cancellation fees. Do you foresee any change in this approach?
Well, I mean, I think it's something that, again, we would do where it's appropriate in the individual case. I mean, that's something that is in our rules at the moment, and so we would think about whether it's appropriate to dismiss something and say, you know, that was commercial judgment. But it will depend on the circumstances again, and so we have to sometimes look at it a bit beyond the initial assessment and just see whether it has been fair. And so that's what we would do in circumstances where we think it needs a bit more looking at. So we'll have a look and see has it been operated fairly, and reach a conclusion on that.
Moving on to the issue of fraud. Fraud is clearly a big area of concern for insurers, and now the Ombudsman is looking at complaints where fraud is alleged, rather than dismissing these as better suited to court. How are insurers supposed to know what level and type of evidence is needed to persuade the Ombudsman that a claim is actually fraudulent?
I mean, again, I think we've always looked at some cases that are about fraud. In other cases, we have at times said, I think that's better dealt with in court, and we will continue to do that. So, I mean, the test for us really is almost a, can I safely decide this? Am I going to be able to get the evidence that I need? You know, in some circumstances, we will look at it and think, actually, this needs a more formal court procedure to get to the bottom of it. So perhaps you might think that it needs cross-examination of witnesses, for example, and that's obviously not something that the Ombudsman does. Ours is an informal alternative to the courts. But certainly we do investigate quite a few cases where fraud is alleged. And I guess, again, I would say that very much there's a need to think about individually the case and what's happened, to look at actually what the consumer has said and done, and to say that just having suspicions and thinking things might look a bit dodgy is not going to be enough in terms of evidence. You do need to be able to produce evidence that shows that there has been some sort of fraudulent activity. And if there has been, then obviously the Ombudsman will look at that and take that into account. But it very much needs to be an individual look at what's happened and what the consumer's actually said and done.
And finally, I just want to touch on the relationship with the regulator in terms of the Ombudsman's relationship to the Financial Conduct Authority. There's a feeling amongst some insurers that there's a divergence of opinions coming from these two bodies. Can you give me some insight into that?
I mean, I think actually the insurance profession is we've had a long tradition of a really good relationship with the insurance industry. I mean, I worked at the Insurance Ombudsman many moons ago now, but I think the insurance industry has always looked to try and understand where the Ombudsman's coming from and to try and learn from that. So I really welcome that, and I'd like that to continue. I do think that actually in some areas, though, there's definitely room for some improvements. I think we still uphold quite a lot of cases in some of the areas which are really quite settled. So in some of our motor and household casework portfolios, at times we're upholding half the cases. Now, I think that's quite high for an area which is relatively settled in terms of the issues that are occurring. So I really would urge, though, that insurers do engage with us, come to our events, go to the website, look at the information there, and contact our technical advice desk if they're not sure, because there's all sorts of things available to try and help insurers to calibrate their approach with ours. So do use them, they're there for them to use.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Thank you for your time. And of course, thank you all for watching. Goodbye.